Welcome to the Motor Carriers Insurance Education Foundation Truck Stop webinar. Truck stops are presented the second Thursday of each month at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. These webinars are open to members of MCIEF only. These webinars are presented as an industry updates for informational purposes only and do not qualify for state CE credit. If you're seeking state CE credit, please contact our website at mcif.org or email our office at trsmcief.org, and you'll find the opportunities for state CE credits. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat window. They will be answered as time allows or responded to after the webinar by email. If you experience audio problems, please send us a note in the chat window or call 800-741-4884. We will attempt to correct the problems as soon as possible. Now let's talk about the webinars. Electronic log devices. There are a lot of data there. How are we going to use it from the insurance industry? I have Tom Bray here from Keller Associates, Inc. Tom and I we just talked a little bit as we set this up met first time in 2010 when we used his CSA book as the cornerstone to teach. And most of you who have been to my programs know that I recommend their products to keep your insureds abreast of what's happening, also to keep the driver qualification file, and I have recommended their CSA book as the way to explain more or learn more about CSA. It's been a real thing. They also are a provider of electronic log devices. There's been a lot of information about it in the marketplace. So I asked Tom if he spent an hour with us today to just go through what the data that is in electronic log devices. As we go through, we can look at how that might be used for insurance purposes. Welcome, Tom.
Well, thank you, Tommy. Good to be here.
Say a little bit about yourself and, of course, a little bit about your company. I hope most people know about it already, and then we'll go ahead with the slides here.
Well, my background is after serving the Army and in college, I drove truck for several years, and then I became a safety person in the industry, working my way up through safety and training into claims and then management. And I came to Keller here, where I oversee a bunch of our online and print products. I do live presentations, and Keller's a services and publishing company that supports the industries in general, transportation, manufacturing, all kinds of industries. We help them with safety and compliance issues, and that kind of sums up what we do.
Yeah, your stuff is great. Again, I use your driver qualification file and things like that. I had a situation where one of my insurers spun off from one company, started a new company up, and they came up to me and asked me to do something to help them be in compliance. And I said, well, where do you get your application from? He said, well, down at Staples. And I said, have you got your drug test set up? He said, what do you mean drug test? I said, before you talk about anything, here's Keller's website. Get that information. Then we'll talk about how I can help you. So this is what I hope agents learn to do, because that information you do have there. And they did do that, by the way, and became compliance, and you help them. So that's how I've used your product, Tom. But let's talk about this electronic log stuff. These are your slides, so let's walk through here, and then I'll put my 2 cents in as we go through.
Sure, and we're going to start with just a basic understanding of what the hours of service regulations are. They're big and they're misunderstood by a lot of people, so we're going to kind of just lay some groundwork down. They're found in Part 395 of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration regulations, which FMCSA is one of the DOT agencies that oversees the motor carrier industry. There's sections in there that cover the limits. In other words, the regulations exist to make sure drivers don't drive when they're fatigued from working too many hours or driving too many hours. So that's kind of the cornerstone of these regulations, are the limits to try to prevent on-road fatigue. Well, to prove that the driver is complying with those limits, they have record-keeping requirements, which is what we're going to talk about today. One of the requirements is electronic logging, or the ELDs. That's just one of the methods that's used to make sure the driver is complying with the limits. And then there's exceptions and exemptions that are in there as well. So there's quite a few of those in Part 395. There's exemptions that excuse utility service drivers when they're repairing or operating or maintaining utility units, utility equipment, from having to do logs or follow limits. The principle there is they don't want people's power to go out and the driver to have to say, I can't go fix that. So there's exceptions in there. We'll touch on those as we go through in different spots. but there's quite a few of them out there now. There's 40 to 50 active exceptions at the moment having to do with hours of service. So there's a lot going on as far as the exceptions go. One of the things the driver is never exempt from is driving ill or fatigued. So if the driver is fatigued, he's worked too many hours, even if he is exempt from the hours of service regulations, he's still going to be expected to stop.
Tom, that reminds me of something. I just printed off a article from the National Law Review, how truck driver fatigue contributes to accidents. This is from the legal industry, and it's coming back and haunting us in the marketplace to use this fatigue situation. And of course, the electronic log is the way that we prove at least they're within these hours of service. I'm not sure there's a one-to-one correlation between are you fatigued or not, but that's really the only measurement. So this is why I think this is so important, not only because of the possibility of fines and penalties and CSA scores, but they're being used against us in court. And I think that's a relevant part. And I like the word you use, fatigue, because this is what we're trying to measure, at least some rules set up for fatigue set up by FMCSA.
Yeah, and that's one of the key things, Tommy, is what the plaintiffs are going to try to do is they're going to try to use the hours to show that the driver was fatigued. These rules exist for the reason of preventing fatigue. Your driver disregarded them. And where ELDs have really complicated this is ELDs are extremely accurate records. So they show exactly what the driver did or didn't do. And if the plaintiffs can use that to show the driver wasn't complying with the hours of service limits, that gives them a foot in the door to prove that fatigue was an issue and that the carrier was operating in such a way that they deserve to be punished, which of course, the way carriers get punished by plaintiffs is the plaintiffs get the jury to give them a larger award. So that's what you want to stay away from.
And we have to pay for it. Two things. I was in a court case, and they called paper logs comic books that way. Mm-hmm. And anybody who worked the song Convoy knows the swindle sheets that we're talking about are paper logs. Just to go back where the history goes.
Right.
If you look at those, so it's been a myth in the marketplace, and that's a real problem we have. And electronic logs should clear this up, at least be something far more accurate. That also, hopefully, as we get through this presentation, what everybody's listening, your agents and your underwriters and producers, is that this also is going to give us some information that we can use later for underwriting, even maybe deal with some pricing and some insured's operation too, as a more than what we have now, paper-wise, IFTAs and those kind of things. Thanks, Tom. Let's go ahead then.
Yeah, I was going to follow up on that quickly. The thing about the electronic logs is there is so much data there. There's a ton of data. It's accurate data. It's accessible. You can get reports out of it. All of that was not true with paper logs. You use the comic book and swindle sheet, analogy. And the other half of that was there just wasn't any data there. You couldn't put that into a database and study it very easily. So that's the other thing that's changed is, as well as now having accurate records, we now have a lot of data to use. So, and we'll get into that in just a second. One thing I want to finish up on this slide before we move on is who's covered by these regulations. And that's anybody that's operating a commercial vehicle. As far as at the interstate level, federal level, that has to do with a vehicle that's 10,001 pounds or more, seats more than 8 or 15, depending on how compensation is handled, or something that's hauling placarded hazardous materials. That surprises a lot of people when they hear that 10,001, because that's basically a big pickup truck. Suddenly you're operating a commercial vehicle and you're subject to these rules. As far as intrastate only drivers that strictly pick up and deliver in one state, never cross state lines, that kind of thing. And the stuff they're picking up is never going to cross a state line. That's going to be covered by the state's motor carrier safety regulations. So the example I use is my home state of Wisconsin. Wisconsin has Trans 327, and they don't make a driver here carry a logbook and follow the limits until the vehicle is 26,000 pounds. But that's for intrastate only drivers. And that's one of the things that people need to be aware of in your industry is if somebody tells them I don't have to use logs, your next question needs to be why not? How come you're not covered by the hours of service? And try to look for what they're up to with that, because they may be one of these carriers. They're intrastate. They only use 15,000 pound vehicles in a state that doesn't require till 26. So there's different things that may be going on, but always ask that question. If somebody tells you I don't have to, my drivers don't have to do logs, my drivers don't have to follow the limits, a good follow-up question is always, well, why not? What do you do different than everybody else that you don't have to do that?
So to remind the audience here, and you've heard me say it often, when we talk about this thing, it's not only the 18-wheelers. We're talking about any dually that the insured might have that could be subject to this. There are a couple exceptions, and we'll dig into that in a few minutes as far as how many times you go beyond a radius and where unique people are back here. I think we have this right now on this tracking part, Tom, but that's a good point.
Yeah, and just remember that 10,001 or more, because that's the cutoff. Above that, if they're involved in interstate commerce. So, and basically the records the driver needs to keep. There's three main ways the records get kept, to show that they're complying with those limits. The one we're talking about today is ELDs. That's what most operations have to have that most people are familiar with as far as trucking or delivering, private fleets, those types of operations. Most of those are in a situation where they need to use ELDs. There are exceptions that allow a driver to use paper logs. You mentioned the big one that's out there. If the driver normally doesn't have to log because he's a short haul driver and uses time records, or the driver's an intermittent driver and he doesn't have to log more than 8 days in any 30-day period, that driver doesn't have to have an ELD. They can use paper logs on those few days they have to log. So, and that's one that gets a lot of carriers in trouble because they don't keep track of that. They just don't really watch that. They believe their drivers never go more than 8 days, so they just let them use paper logs all the time. So when they need to log, they use paper. They just need to be aware that there's that cutoffs there. Other exceptions exist for drive-away, tow-away companies. They don't own the vehicle they're driving. RV drive-away, tow-away drivers are exempt and allowed to use paper logs. And a driver that's driving a vehicle that's older than model year 2000 is allowed to use paper logs because it has to do with the electronics on the vehicles before the year 2000. So in those circumstances, that's another one of those where if a insured tells you that they're using paper logs, the next question needs to be why? What exception are you using that allows you to do that? And then there's time records. So there's logging exemptions that are in Part 395 that say if the driver stays within this radius and gets back within these many hours, they can use a time record rather than a log. One of the reasons I'm being fuzzy on numbers is because they're going to change here at the end of September.
Yes, that's the thing that's happening. I'm never speaking this part of here. And one thing that drives us in the industry crazy, and again, if you've heard of a glider kit, this is where you take an engine that's older than 2000 and put it in this new cab and rails and all there to avoid the electronic log devices. Folks, that's just spinning out of control. It's someone who just so wants to violate or at least marginally get around the hours of service. This is a real concern to me as someone who wants these people to be compliant as far as possible, how to do that. But Tom, that this is how we have some mentality with some of those drivers out there who have gone to that extent.
Yeah, there's drivers and carriers that literally went and bought 1999, 1998 model trucks just to get the engine out of it to put into their brand new 2019 or 2020 truck, so they don't have to do an ELD. And the question, the question that should come up when somebody does that, as far as being an insurer, is why did you do that? What are you up to that you have to put that much time, effort, and money into avoiding putting an electronic log into your vehicle? That's one of those curious things as an insurer you probably want to dig into and ask a couple of questions about.
And you use an engine that gets 7 miles or 6 miles to a gallon versus a new one that gets 12 miles to a gallon.
Mm-hmm.
and some things like that even complicates it too. That's the part that you have. Anyway, go ahead, Tom.
Sure. All right. Touched on this. The exemptions that are out there as far as what you have to be doing to be able to use paper logs rather than the electronic logs rather than the ELDs. And as I mentioned, I kind of got ahead of myself there. If a carrier says that they're not required to use an ELD, figure out why. What's the reason? So get to the bottom of that and look into it. Don't just take their word for it. Now let's get into the. Oh, go ahead.
One question. To me, the worst exemption that we deal with on a regular basis for for our insureds who are involved in the motor carriers insurance education, which is typically a truckload carrier, Tom, is the agricultural exemption. I mean, the whole idea that they don't have to start the log until they're 150 miles away from where they started. where they last picked up, and when they get within 150 miles of where they're going to deliver, they don't have to be on the hours of service exemption doesn't apply, and their electronic logs doesn't apply. Man, that means they can drive for a whole lot of time that's unaccounted for.
Well, one of the interesting things with the ag exception, when the driver's within 150 miles of the source, the driver is not subject to the limits. They're not subject to the logging requirements. They're not subject to anything having to do with hours of service. So you mentioned one of the things that when they pick up the load for the first time, when they're inside that 150-mile radius, so basically for the first 150, maybe up to 200 miles of driving, because there's a difference between radius and road miles, that doesn't count towards their limit. So the 2, 3, 4 hours loading, the 3 or 4 hours of driving to get to the edge of the 150 air mile radius, none of that counts. All of a sudden, when they hit that 150 miles, now the clock starts counting, but they could be 5, 8, 10, 12 hours into their day already when they finally start counting hours towards the log. So from there, they have a 14-hour work day and an 11-hour driving period during that 14 hours they can do. So in theory, the driver could be driving 24, 25, 28 hours later legally because of the ag exemption. And that's, to me, is not even the scariest aspect of that exemption. If the driver stays within 150 air mile radius all the time, in other words, he's doing short haul work basically, but it's all agricultural. He's not subject to any limits. He can literally run that truck 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So what it comes back to in that case is, does the company have a strong culture in place that can deal with fatigue? In other words, if a driver is fatigued, realizes it, does he have the authority and the ability to stop, park, and go to sleep at that point? Or is the company in a position where they're trying to push him to do more? But yeah, that's one of the exemptions that gets troublesome, especially certain times of year. You come into the fall of the year for harvesting, spring of the year for planting, when those ag operations are trying to run as hard as they possibly can. Without those limits in place, there's got to be that strong culture in place and that strong understanding of fatigue and fatigue countermeasures.
And that's why I mentioned that, because that's one of the major classes of business that our audience are listening to, that they do right. It's why, my father, as you know, was a trucker, Tom, and I remember him loading loads in Fort Myers, Florida, and say, well, you need to be in New York on the next day after tomorrow opening market at 12:01 a.m. and here's a couple of bennies to keep you awake while you're going that way. So, and that's still prevalent in the agriculture area, and that's the scary part about that.
Yeah, and that's where you've got to make sure you're insured that if they're using that ag exemption. This goes back to what we were talking about earlier. If they're using the exemption, which one? Well, they mentioned they're using the ag exemption. The next question is, what do you have in place for fatigue countermeasures? What are you doing to make sure your drivers are not running around fatigued? Have you trained them on what fatigue is, what the signs of fatigue are? Fatigue. I'll get that right eventually. What the signs of fatigue are. Have you trained them on, stopping, napping, breaks is appropriate? Have they worked with their drivers on those types of issues? Because that's going to be the big thing. Since there's no limits constraining them, there needs to be something there to constrain the drivers.
And then what's going to be found, just for you to make a full circle, is in the court cases, what's going to happen is, what is your insured done from a paperwork and monitoring their drivers such that they're not driving fatigue, even though they're exception to the logs. And if they have things in their rule books that now the driver's violating, then that ends up more dollars also. All right, Tom, that's enough on that. Well, let's go ahead. I like this next slide. Go ahead. Here's the data. Let's get down to that.
Let's get into the data. This is what we're here to talk about today. Electronic logs generate just tons and tons of useful data. One of the ways to think of the data is it comes in two general buckets, or two big buckets. There's the compliance data. That's the stuff that FMCSA directly requires the device to capture. And we'll get into that in just a minute here. There's just tons of stuff that has to be captured to make it a compliant device. The second thing that most of these systems capture is they capture safety and operations information. So they're capturing anything that the ECM on the vehicle it can capture and hold and display. So just got a list of things on there. We'll cover some of these later on in the presentation, but it can cover everything. It can be capturing everything from hard braking incidents, which are indicating the driver's either following too close or he's inattentive. Once in a great while is one thing, constantly is another. It can pick up excessive speed, routing issues. So there's lots of things that these devices can capture that's not required by the regulations, that carriers a lot of times are storing and using. So you need to be familiar with it because, you might want to use it as an insurer, and that plaintiff's attorneys are going to dig into it and use it. So just need to be familiar with what's there. As far as the compliance data goes, here's what is specifically required that the device captures. It has to capture the date and time. It's got to capture a location during normal operations. That location has to be accurate to within 1 mile. So it's not just he's somewhere in Central Florida. No, he is 3 miles southwest of Kissimmee. So that it'll nail it down to exactly where the driver is when it does a data capture. It's got to capture the vehicle miles. Mm-hmm.
I loved Kissimmee. It's not Kissimmee, it's Kissimmee. You did it right. I just want to give you credit for saying it right. Go ahead.
Well,
We're in Florida this all the time.
Yeah, I had an uncle that flew for the museum there, so flew airplanes for the museum there. So that's why I know that. But yeah, also vehicle miles have to be captured. So there's a running record of the mileage from each of these checks that this thing has to do. Same with engine hours, it's tracking the engine hours. So it accumulates up how many hours are on that engine. Driver and carrier information's got to be captured, so which driver was in the vehicle at that time. Driver duty status has got to be captured. That's the whole idea, to track what the driver's doing. And vehicle identification is going to be captured, which is an interesting thing that can be used downstream for all kinds of purposes. Which vehicles were rolling around, where they were, so because it does nail it down specifically to the vehicle involved. Yeah,
that's the point that most people don't understand. These are vehicle, not driver, but vehicle noted here. And so back when we were discussing if the insurer's using the vehicles or not, if you got a copy of the electronic log devices for that vehicle, then if they have parked them or not, if they're using them or not. So that's a very important part that most people don't know. Electronic logs do show the vehicle. It's not a driver sensitive, it's a vehicle sensitive.
Yeah, it's a strange system because it's designed to track the driver's hours, what the driver's doing. It automatically captures driving time is the biggest thing that it does. But to make it work, it has to be mounted in vehicles. So you've got both sides connected. You've got the driver connected to it, and you've got the vehicle connected to it. So it is a pretty robust record. And here's the list of when these captures have to be taken. In other words, all that data we just mentioned, it has to be captured every time the vehicle is started up, every time it is shut down, every time a driver logs into the electronic log, it has to do one of those data captures, and every time they log out, every time the driver changes duty statuses. So as the driver's day goes by, he has to put in there he's on duty, he's off duty, he's in the sleeper. Whenever the driver starts driving, the vehicle automatically has to put the driver to the driving status. Whenever he stops driving, it's going to ask him after 5 minutes, do you want me to stay on duty or do you want to stay driving? What status do you want to go to? If he doesn't tell the device anything, it's going to put him in the on-duty status. So there's a lot going on as far as duty changes constantly. Well, if there's no duty changes going on, no logging in, no logging out, no starting up or shutting down, in other words, the driver's just out driving, once per hour when that vehicle's in operations, it's going to do one of those data captures. So there is a lot of data being captured on a regular basis. If a driver's having a day where they're constantly unloading and reloading, switching trailers, those kinds of things, you're going to have a lot of duty changes. So you're going to have a lot of those data captures. So you'll have a real good idea how long that vehicle is running, where it was going, what it was doing. If the driver was on the road making a long trip, you're going to have those hourly pings, those hourly data captures showing what that vehicle was up to, and what that driver was up to. So there is a lot of data generated in these systems, just based on what's required by the rules. So here's some of the things that this data provides you with, that if you look at the raw data. The raw data is kind of hard to read unless you get experience with it, and it's one of those things. Ask for it once in a while. If there's have a specific reason to ask for it. Different systems display it in different ways because there's different vendors out there. The one that's on the screen here that shows this by Fallon, Nevada, that's a generic one taken from the regulations, by the way, is where that came from. But it kind of gives you the general idea and the general layout of what these displays look like, but they will be different from vendor to vendor because every vendor has their own pretty way of displaying it or their own neat way of displaying it. But it's always going to have this data. It's just a matter of how it's specifically arranged and how it's specifically displayed. So you'll always see that. You'll always see the date and time. You'll always see the location and the miles, the hours. what was going on. In other words, what triggered this capture, and whether it was an automatic one or a driver. So you'll always see that basic information in that raw data. And what that raw data can show you is the driver's complying. The driver complied with limits. You can see on there this, the driver started at this time and he ended his driving at this time, and there's this break in there. So you can if you know the limits, you can look at that data and figure out, okay, he complied, or she didn't comply, whatever the case might be. The other thing this shows you is it gives you a breadcrumb trail for movements. And this has come to help a lot of carriers over the years. It's also hurt a lot of carriers over the years because the driver's involved, or the vehicle's involved in a hit and run, or they're accusing your vehicle of being involved in a hit and run. This breadcrumb trail can help nail down, okay, was that vehicle there or not? And that comes, it's a double-edged sword. It can help you, it can hurt you, but at least it lets you know what you're dealing with. The other thing that breadcrumb tells you is where the driver's doing his thing. Where's that driver operate? And last but not least, the raw data tells you the driver that was used, which driver's using which vehicles. So you're looking at this data, you can tell the drivers that operate and the vehicles are operating. So there's a lot there just in that raw data that the system is generating. Other things this can tell you, that you can kind of accumulate this data up and look at it in a cumulative approach, and things it can show you is their area of operation. If the carrier is operating in a fairly small regional area, that'll show up in the data. When you look at the data, they don't go any further than this. It's going to show their hours of operations, which is how they fitting in with circadian rhythm. Are they, when are they operating? So you can look at different reports and figure that out. And what are their miles per unit is a critical thing. They can run a mileage report typically. In most of these systems, they can pull a mileage report out, and you can see from that report, how many miles are they doing monthly, annually, and just get that data to figure out what the risk is, because there's a big difference in risk between a power unit that's running 130,000 miles a year all over the eastern half of the United States versus one that's running 60,000 miles a year in central Montana. So there's a lot of data there that can be brought out of the system. It's required data that's been captured. But there's different reports you can get out of that data, or you can review that data and look at these things, and it can give you quite a bit of information as far as what that carrier is doing and what's going on.
Tom, this is a good slide. Let me go back to what we've been using in the past just to relate what you're saying. We've looked at IFTAs as the cornerstone to not only determine how many miles a truck gets, and for about every 100, 105,000 miles, we typically want a premium varying up or down a little bit, depending on more, if they had more miles than that, less, if a little credit for that. We also get reports from our third-party providers, carrier software, and CAB, that shows the radiuses, but that's based on where the insured has been inspected. What we're telling you here is that with electronic log device information, you can get their exact radius, because you can go and see where they're traveling without having to worry about where they're inspected or not. And you also are going to get the actual miles, which creates a problem in the transitional period, because this was only effective, Tom, March last year was when it was enforced for everybody, so we're a year into it. Here is that if you based your previous premium on the paper, the IFTA reports, which are usually based on zip codes or on the moving and storage mileage, now that they have the exact miles of electronic log devices, Tom, I predict that that's probably maybe 10, 15% more miles on the exact than the old way, or give and take. In other words, you got to have apples for apples. And during this transition, you could have looked at the risk when you wrote it before looking at the paper logs, but now with electronic logs, just know that you've got a different set of data. And so this is far more accurate than what we've been using before as the measurement of the insured's activities, location-wise and miles-wise, with this more accurate information.
Yeah, and that's the big thing that changed between IFTA and these. This is a lot more accurate. It's nailing things down a lot tighter, especially versus the paper IFTA process, because there was some issues with the paper IFTA process. Still are for carriers that are using it. But this is a lot more accurate data. Now, here's one of the things you want to look at with your carriers, with your insureds. Are they using the data? Because there's a lot there that the carrier can be using and doing to help bring their risk down, to help their company operate safely and compliantly. So there's a lot of things that they can do, that data is there for them to act on. One of the things that all of the ELD systems have, it's just a matter of how intricate or how thorough the systems are what are called exception reports. This is a backwards kind of thing versus the other type of exception. What you're looking for in a system when it comes to an ELD system are reports that are telling the carrier what's going wrong. They should have a report in that system that's telling them when they're getting hours of service problem or hours of service violations. So they should be able to pull a report out daily that says these drivers went over hours yesterday, or these drivers are over hour today. Or they should have an alerting system that tells somebody within the company, driver Judy just went over hours, whatever the person has done, it shows up right away. There's unassigned driving reports that are in there. That is a critical exception report, because one of the most common ways drivers falsify their logs to be able to operate more hours is they just don't log in, and that generates unassigned driving time. So the carrier needs to be looking at that report regularly. The edit report is out there. They need to be looking at that to determine what's going on. Why are drivers or supervisors going in and changing the records? Hard braking reports, we'll talk about these in a little bit here, because those fall into that safety bucket. But are they looking? Do they know there's a hard braking report in their system? Are they looking at it? Most of the systems have that. Are there speed or RPM alert reports in there? And is there fuel mileage report? Because fuel mileage sounds kind of odd, because that's a profit and loss thing. Yes, but it also indicates a driver that's not operating the vehicle correctly. The way they drop their fuel mileage is excessive speed, harsh braking. There's different driving habits that can drop their mileage down below the average. So that's something else that the carrier should be looking at. So one of the questions you need to ask a carrier is, are you looking at these reports, and are you using them? And are you using them quickly? Because these systems will report this stuff. They can run the report daily and see what happened up to that point yesterday and today until now. And then are they acting on it?
And the important part of this is that later when you deal, and we're dealing with a new area here, and what Tom just went through will be involved later in the court case. And when Tom talks about carrier, I always have this problem, Tom. We're dealing with insurance carriers versus motor carriers. So I always try to use motor carriers and insurance companies this time, just like we're talking about brokers. There's a freight broker or an insurance agent. So we have some similar terminology in this area, but he's talking about, is our insureds, the motor carrier, using this data to make sure their drivers are compliant. And then what happens is they write elaborate rules and reg books that they give to us. Here we're safety, here's our safety plan, here's what we do. Yet now they don't use this new data to see if their drivers are living within those rules. And if they're not, then that's going to end up hurting us in court, where you're not even following your own rules. So this is the good and the bad about this stuff, is that now that we have the good, are the information, and then we can find out, is the insured drivers and is the insured proactive, making sure they follow those things, but at the same time, are they also following their own regs and rules that they have given those drivers? And if not, then it's going to cost us money later. So this is why important question I'd ask retail agents when you first approach an insured is, do you have electronic logs, and how are you using them as far as managing your drivers? And as an underwriter, you would want maybe that question asked. And obviously for the people who are listening to us who are loss prevention people that are on behalf of our insurance companies, hopefully you're already looking at this and asking this question. But this is the area we're dealing with right now. Are you living with your own regs and rules? Forget the government. Are you dealing with your own regs and rules? And how often are you looking at these to make sure that your drivers are living within those things?
Yeah, are you doing what you need to do with the data as a motor carrier? I'll remember to say motor carrier. Are you looking at that data as a motor carrier, and are you acting on it? Are you doing something with it? Because if you're not, it's going to come back and haunt you, and the haunting is going to be terrible, as you mentioned, if you have it written in your policies that the drivers can't do these things, and you had the ability to check it and you weren't. So big issue there. I'm going to touch on some of these things specifically now, like unassigned driving time. There's legitimate reasons it happens. A driver forgets to log in, or the vehicle's being driven by a non-driver, such as a mechanic moving it around a yard, those types of things. But the big one your motor carriers need to be looking at and addressing is, it's one of the most common ways drivers falsify in an electronic logging system. So the carrier's held responsible in the rules for assigning the time to the correct driver. It'll turn up in a report that the carrier has to have in their system. And what the carrier has to do according to the regulations is then look at the unassigned driving time and either assign it to the correct driver or attach an explanation explaining why they couldn't. So as a underwriter, insurance representative, anybody like that that's looking at carriers, you want to see, do they have that process in place? Is the carrier actually doing that? Or do they have, and I've seen this already, do they have an unassigned driver account that has 7,000 entries in it? Because in the last 6 months, they've never reviewed one of them. So you've got to look at that. Are they doing this? Because this is where, if the drivers are going to falsify a log, this is the most common place it's going to turn up.
And it's going to come up twice when they get knock on the door, or they now get the virtual audits, meaning FMCSA audits. There, have they done this? And if they haven't done this, then you're going to get a conditional or maybe even unsatisfactory rating. Or a second time, the plaintiff's attorneys understand everything Tom said, and they're going to subpoena these records and bring this up to the jury. This is when you're going to see this happening. And what happens is, hopefully the motor carriers don't ever get audited and never gets in court, but that doesn't mean they might not. So they don't need to get complacent in this area without making sure they use this information to make sure their drivers are living within the FMCSA regs and also their own regs.
Yeah, and living within the limits. That's one of the key things. So that touches on the next thing we're coming to here, is the over hours stuff. There's reports that the carrier should be getting, should be pulling, should be looking at, that tell them when their drivers are operating over hours. So the questions that you need to ask a motor carrier is, how often are you pulling these records? How often are you looking at them? How much are your drivers over the limit? How often is that happening? If the reports they're handing you show that they have a daily issue with drivers operating over hours, that's not a good thing. Or as this screen shows, you have one driver that's constantly operating over hours. That's not a good thing. That's the driver that's going to come back to haunt you and the motor carrier if that driver's ever involved in a crash, because this data is going to be brought into the court case. It's going to be reviewed. The plaintiff's expert's going to see this and say, wow, I can't believe they let this person keep driving with their common practices, what they were doing. So the carrier's got to be staying on top of this. The motor carrier's got to know how to get this report out, what's in it, and how to act on it. The edits are another method that's commonly done. They're commonly used to falsify an electronic log. The typical model is the driver's running short on their weekly hours because they have 60 or 70 hour weekly limits. It's a rolling 7 or 8 day period. So using the term weekly is kind of a loose term. But the driver's running short on hours there. So one of the temptations is to go back to previous days and change on duty time to off duty time. And lo and behold, suddenly I have hours available. It's a common method of falsification that drivers with electronic logs use. Therefore, it's something that the motor carrier needs to have a process in place to deal with. You need to ask the motor carrier, are you auditing this? When somebody puts in an edit, are you looking at the situation? Are you seeing if it was just a matter he forgot to log out last night? Or is it a matter he's going back to 4 days ago, changing on duty to off duty to try to create more hours? So you need to figure out, does that motor carrier have a process in place to deal with this?
Tom, let me talk about this. Well, here, all right, you got the next slide. You're this is what I'm talking about. The third bullet down, the second bullet down there, the personal conveyance, because we haven't gone through the first. Let's go to this. Okay, we're getting where we go.
I knew where you wanted to go next, so that's why I did the quick slide.
It's already there, right?
One of the things that's in the electronic logging system are called special categories, and these were put in place to cut down on editing, because in the old style electronic systems, the way these issues had to be handled was through editing. Well, what FMCSA did is they put into the rule, they put these two special categories called yard move. In other words, the driver's moving the vehicle on private property where the public can't have access. And in that case, they put it in yard move, and it logs the time as on duty time rather than driving time, which is where it should be. Or the other special category is personal conveyance, which personal conveyance is where the driver's using the commercial vehicle as a personal vehicle. So there's a bunch of catches that come with that personal conveyance thing, because you can see where this can get a little problematic, because when the driver puts it in personal conveyance, it logs the time as off duty, which is good for the driver. So there's a temptation there to misuse it. Well, what the law enforcement and auditors, really, it's honest.
Really?
Honest.
When I listen to our friend Mark Willis on the talk radio shows and all, and they have this is the most discussed area. What is personal conveyance? And what we dealt with is this was the problem before that everybody used to hedge. I don't use the word cheat, Tom. Hedge on the logs, like they're loading and now that they are finished loading, but that's the 14th hour they've been on duty. And do they have to park in the lot? I even had one risk that said they had to call the wrecker and move the yard to the next rest place. This is what personal conveyance means personally there. There's also later, we're going to get a court case, and I don't have time to open it up here, is personal conveyance going to be covered under non-trucking versus the motor carrier's liability policy, because now it could even be a load on it, and it could be personal conveyance getting out of that yard to the next rest place. It's going to be a lot of discussion later, and I still think this is personal conveyance, Tom. I don't know if you agree with me or not. It's still up to a lot of discussion and hasn't been completely ironed out yet as far as all the enforcement done right, or at least looked at it the same way.
Yeah, to me, the big thing is when it comes to personal conveyance, if the carrier has a policy authorizing it, whether it's case by case or a blanket policy, the next thing is the driver legitimately and truthfully off duty. You know, that the driver can honestly say, yeah, I'm off duty doing what I want to do at this point. Is the destination a purely personal destination? Is the driver going to a hotel, going to a restaurant, going home for his days off? You know, so there's that aspect. Is there any benefit to the company? Because if there's any benefit to the company, you can't call it personal conveyance. So if the vehicle's ending up in a better location, you can't call it personal conveyance. So there's these cases where it's real clear cut, because yes, it fits all of those examples, or the one that you used where the customer, or in extreme cases, an officer has told the driver, you have to move your vehicle, but the driver doesn't have hours. The driver's allowed to use personal conveyance to get to the nearest safe place in those circumstances. So there's clear-cut cases where, yes, that's personal conveyance, but where you get in trouble with this, and where motor carriers get themselves in trouble, is they start playing the what I refer to as the kind of game. Yeah, well, he can kind of say he's off duty, or he's kind of going to a personal place, but along the way we're going to have him get an oil change on the truck. So it kind of is personal. That's where all of a sudden the issue comes in. And as you mentioned, right now there's a lot of interpretation that goes on when the situation gets looked at by officers or investigators or plaintiffs. You know, was this legitimate? Does it fall completely into the personal conveyance category? If not, that's where problems come into play. So something's got to be dealt with very, very carefully by the carrier. And that's where the motor carrier has to have a good policy that they're actually using and enforcing. And part of that is looking at the report that shows personal conveyance and verifying that all the personal conveyance on there is stuff they know about and that they've vetted. And yes, we know that was truly personal use. And so there's that whole aspect that they need to be dealing with it.
And here's the conflict. Tom just said again and again, it's the motor carriers say how their driver used personal conveyance, where some motor carriers don't want to chance it and won't allow any personal conveyance. So it starts with how the motor carrier wants to do it, and then is the motor carrier meeting the definition of public conveyance as put up FMCSA. So you have two levels here that needs to be considered. Not only is the regulations, and you have a lot of drivers who say, well, the federal government says this personal conveyance, but my insured, but who I'm working for, particularly on operators, don't allow that. That's going to be a conflict, and it'll always go back, which is the least off duty, which is the most prevalent one will end up ruling in that case.
Mm-hmm. Very good point. One of the other things a motor carrier needs to watch is malfunctions, because one of the ways that certain drivers get around having to use an electronic log is they create a malfunction. The most common way is just unplug the device. So just so you're aware, that's the most common way it's done. But they'll create a malfunction because they want to use paper logs. And you use the term fudge, I use the term flexibility. The driver just needs the flexibility of the paper log to be able to get to where he needs to be. So, but that's what's going on in a lot of these cases. And what the carrier needs to be doing is, whenever there is a malfunction, do they look into it? Is there a practice in place that they look into it, and then they really aggressively audit those paper logs when they come in? using everything. So and do the drivers know that's going to happen? Because that's a preventative measure. If the drivers know that this is really going to get dug into and they're really going to get questioned and grilled over it when there's a malfunction, that'll dissuade some of the marginal drivers from unplugging the device and creating the malfunction. So this is something a motor carrier needs to be keeping an eye on. And as far as an insurance aspect, this is one of those things you need to ask about. What's your internal process for dealing with a malfunction when they come up?
Tom, and there has been some legitimate malfunction by the vendors themselves, and you just mentioned it. I would almost bet you lunch, and hopefully next year in October I can take you to dinner, at least at the conference. But with this new hours of service regs that have been changed as of next month, I promise you there are going to be a few situations where some of these vendors aren't going to be up to date on that. And that's the kind of stuff that actually the motor carrier nor the driver has in control of it that might end up surfacing here.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing. There are legitimate malfunctions. That's why they have the malfunction procedures in the regulations, because that does happen. And you mentioned there's been a couple of vendors and it happens, it's technology, where they had upgrade. The biggest thing that seems to happen is they have an update issue where all of a sudden things just go a little goofy with an update, and suddenly you have a whole brand of ELDs that aren't functioning correctly and have to be put in the malfunction mode. So that does happen. The catch as a carrier is determining, okay, as a motor carrier, did this driver trigger the malfunction, or was it a legitimate malfunction? Did the device fail? Could it no longer record the information? Could it no longer forward it to officers, a legitimate malfunction, or did we have a system malfunction that knocked everybody out for those 6, 8, 10, 12 hours or a day or two? So the big thing with the motor carrier is, do they have a process in place to look into it to see what happened? One of the kind of wrap up what we're talking about here, the risks of not auditing are pretty obvious. The carrier is going to get in all kinds of trouble with the agency, with officers on the road because their drivers aren't behaving correctly. During litigation, there's just all kinds of risks. The big thing to offset those risks when you're talking to a carrier, kind of sum up what we're talking about here. Can the motor carrier give you the required data when you ask them for it? Can they give you data for specific drivers, specific vehicles? Can they give you that data that you're asking for? When you ask for reports, I want to see how many hours violations you've had in the last couple of months or last 30 days or whatever window is. Can they come up with those reports for you? I want to see how many incidents of unassigned driving you have in your unassigned driving account. Can they come up with those reports? Because if they can't come up with those reports, that's a problem. They should be using them regularly. They should know how to locate them. They should be able to work with them. And then the next question is, can you explain to me how you're using this information? What do you do with your unassigned driving events? What do you do about drivers that are over hours that the reports are showing? So is the carrier using that data? Are they auditing themselves, and are they doing something with it? If they're not auditing, these are the risks involved. And Tommy, you know about these just a whole lot more than I probably do. The drivers are going to figure out that nobody's watching. If the motor carrier's not using the data, they're going to figure out nobody's watching, and suddenly falsification is going to be the way everybody goes. Roadside inspections are going to go terribly because the driver's electronic logs will catch the officer's attention. So the bad things are going to happen to them on the road, which then leads to audits, which then leads to bad things during audits. During the audit, one of the really bad things that can happen is the investigator looks at the situation and says, you don't have safety management controls. You're not managing this at all. And that's when they give the carrier the out-of-service order, which is never a good thing. And this is the part I know, Tommy, you could talk to all day probably. The plaintiff's attorneys are going to be able to show that carrier they had no business operating, so we need to punish them. So.
Tom, and I want to couple one other thing here, and again, this would be another subject matter another day, is now they're doing more off-site investigations, meaning that they allowed this before, but there's more and more of those, and some of those off-site investigations, I don't know if they call them virtual or not, I think it's on desktop investigations, now can lead to a compliance score or rating. And so what happens is, and again, please correct me if I miss a time frame, is that they're going to call up and say, send me Joe Blow's logs or send me this vehicle logs and let me all this kind of reports and audit done. And they're going to have, 24 hours to upload that information and send it to them. They're not going to have time to correct all this stuff. So if they're not doing on an ongoing basis and they do have that call to have the desktop or virtual audit, it's going to be a real problem now because it might end up with an unsatisfactory conditional rating that before they weren't going to get, a lot of people aren't going to get audited because the DOT office didn't have time, but now they're getting more and more of these audits. And I think that's going to couple this information even more important, Tom.
Yeah, this is coming into this year. FMCSA has put a big push into, this was happening before all the COVID problems, but they were putting a big push into getting more and more audits done as offsites. And as you mentioned, the process is the investigator contacts the carrier, says, I'm going to need this information. And then they'll contact them again, say, okay, this portal is now open, upload this information. So, you know, and it's going to be done remotely at the investigator's desk. So it's a whole new paradigm. And the COVID incident over this last year has really pushed this forward. They're really pushing these now. And yeah, you can end up failing an audit without ever even seeing the investigator. So you need to be prepared for that.
And the new wrinkle to this is that now before it was a focus audit, but now it can lead to a compliance audit, which will include a safety rating at the end. So there's now more chance that they're going to get conditional unsatisfactory than ever before.
Yeah, the focused on-site or off-site, either one, if they do enough of the core compliance review components, they can end up with a rating out of it. So yeah, that's something a motor carrier needs to be aware of. Okay, let's talk about the other half of this, and that's the safety data. We kind of touched on it earlier, but basically the ELD, we're going to jump on to the next topic, so I hope everybody kept up. It's capturing anything that the engine control module or the ECM can capture. So, you know, there's the list there that we talked about earlier. That's all being captured by most ELDs, because the ELDs, the majority of vendors have taken the view that there's a lot of data there that a carrier could be using, so we want to make it available to them. So as well as taking the required data off of the ECM that the ELD needs, they're capturing all this other stuff to give carriers the ability to do performance tracking and to improve driver habits and performance. So this is available in most systems, and this is one of the ones that's going to get a lot of carriers in trouble because they don't realize in some cases that this is being captured and stored in their ELD system. The scary part is it's also being captured in the ECM. So it's been there for years. The ECM has been capturing these things for years. Plaintiff's attorneys several years ago figured out that it was in the ECM. It's just now it's going to be in the ELD as well. So it's another access point, and it's an easier access point to get this data.
Tom, that's a big point. The EMC, the electronic control modulars, access, sometimes it was very proprietary and they had to pay and go to a dealership and you know, some were easier to get, some wasn't, and a third party had to be involved. Now it's all going to be here within the electronic log device without somebody else having to get involved in it. Yeah,
and that's the key. And one of the big things that's going to be in that system is if it's built in there as an option. This is where having some knowledge of the vendor, in other words, you talk to your motor carrier and they say they have I'll just use our company. They have a J.J. Keller system in the vehicle. Well, you might want to make a call to J.J. Keller and say, okay, we understand the ELD data is there as far as what they need for compliance, but what else is being captured in those systems? That's especially important to do if the carrier can't tell you what the system is capturing. So, but yeah, one of the things you want to do when it comes to hard braking is ask that insured for their hard brake report. If they know how to use their system, if it has it in there, they'll be able to present it to you and say, here's what we have. So what's causing these is rapid deceleration, the driver's hitting the brakes hard. And there's different reasons that happen, and that happens, and that's on the list there. In other words, it's a bad driving habit that's surfacing. And there's nothing that's gonna help the motor carrier in court if this comes to light that this driver had multiple hard braking incidents and the carrier did nothing about them, because the plaintiff will undoubtedly get this data and use it. So, couple other things you need to check with your insured on. Do they have a realistic threshold, or they have it set so low that everybody's constantly getting hard brake incidents? Because that's one of the problems that you see. The carrier doesn't understand how to set the threshold correctly. And do they have a reasonable limit? In other words, if a driver's allowed 1 a month, or is the driver allowed 10 or 12 a month? You know, what do they have a reasonable limit built into that? And are they concentrating on the outliers, the drivers that are constantly getting hard brakes? And one of the things that you've got to watch out for is an insured telling you, but, oh, that's okay because he's a city driver. No, that's not okay. That means he's in town slamming the brakes on all the time. It's probably scarier than anything else.
Yeah, that might be worse. Yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, and one of the things to watch out for, though, is there is a vehicle issue. Sometimes the vehicle has problems. It's got a brake issue, or it's got an ECM issue where suddenly it's triggering all kinds of hard brakes. So that goes back to, do they have these thresholds in place, and do they look at these things? And that's something you want to make sure they're doing. Speed is another thing that's captured in these systems. So it captures high speed incidents, and it captures high average speeds. So is the carrier looking at this report? Can they give you this report? Can they tell you what they do with it? Are they dealing with the outliers? You know, are they doing something with those drivers that are constantly turning up on this report? And here's the big thing. You know, if a carrier's not using that safety data, those drivers' bad habits they're going to, if anything, they're going to continue or possibly even get worse. They're going to do more of that. So if it's a driver that's collecting hard braking because they're tailgating, they're going to continue doing it. Then the question becomes not, you know, if the crash happens, when the crash happens, how bad is it going to be? So, you know, they've got to use that data for the purpose intended. That's the reason the vendor has made that available to them. They need to look at it. They need to deal with it. And that data is going to show bad habits. If the driver has them, it's going to show it. So I always like to say this about the data, by the way. The data itself isn't good or bad. It's
the data.
It's what you did with it. Exactly. Right. You know, if it was showing you bad things and you fixed the bad things, the bad data was actually good. That sounds odd, but it makes sense to me anyways. To sum it up, you know, the carriers can become more at risk over time if they're not using the safety data correctly. And this is going to be discovered. It's going to come to light, you know, as far as if they're not using this data correctly. If the motor carrier is not using the compliance and safety data, it shows up. In litigation, it shows up as, you know, they're not living up to their duty to act. They had this data, they had access to it, and they weren't using it. That's going to lead them to negligence issues. A compliance review is going to get them in that lack of safety management controls area. You had this and you weren't acting on it. So you obviously have no safety management controls. And either of those, that's going to create a problem for an insurer. You know, if that carrier is involved in a crash and there was a bad compliance review involved, and no safety management controls in place, it's going to get ugly for the insurer in a quick and fast hurry. And kind of one of my summary slides here, you know, a good carrier, they're going to know the system. A good motor carrier is going to know their system. They're going to be able to give you these reports. They're going to take action on the data that the system is showing them. They're going to watch the safety performance data and take action on that. So if they see hard braking, they have a process in place for getting that to stop. In other words, they're taking that bad data and making good data at the end of the day with it. And they have low on-road violation rate. You know, their drivers know how to use the Eld'S. They're not getting violations on the road for misusing them or for not using them correctly. Other carriers, well, you know, they're the ones they're either encouraging unsafe or non-compliant behaviors, or they're just not doing anything. And what ends up happening is they're going to have on-road issues. They're going to have compliance issues. They're going to have all kinds of issues. So. And, you know, following a crash, which one do you want to be standing next to? You know, the good carrier that has lots of data showing that they are a good carrier and something bad just happened to them. They had everything in place. They were doing everything they said they were going to do. They were using all the tools that the system gave them. Or, you know, you want to be standing next to the carrier that the data shows that their bad culture finally just caught up with them and then led to this big crash. So I can pretty well guess which one I'd want to be standing next to. So. And the way you sort them out is ask them for the reports and data, and are they acting on it? And review that data yourself and compare it to reality. Because it's one of the things, the driver or the carrier might say, yes, we do this with our drivers. Yes, we do that. but the data just shows things are terrible. So it doesn't make any difference what they're doing. There's a disconnect somewhere in there that becomes fairly obvious when you start looking at the data.
Tom, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. This is your email address, and Tom's a friend of the foundation. He and I go back, and he's been supporting of the educational efforts. Encourage y'all to contact him when needed, and he can help you this. But just a summarization, so a couple little quick questions here. What we're looked through here is we talked about the event recorders, we've talked about EMCs, we've talked about if the reports, we've talked about the radiuses based on inspections, we've talked about all that as part of the underwriting and critical information we needed to decide to write insured or not. We also talked about how adversely bad CSA scores lead into court cases, and that's the reptilian theory. What we're talking about now with electronic log devices is now there's even more data here that can either be helpful to us to understand the insured's a good operation, as Tom puts out, or worry about a court case if they're not. So agents, retail agents, you need to start becoming more knowledgeable of this, and hopefully this is the first time that the foundation brings this to your attention. If you don't already know it, we plan to have Tom involved more often as this stuff gets involved. It might end up being how we choose to write risk. How do we now monitor even pricing based on where they're going, and things like before we had no exact information here. One other thing, Tom, how can we, if I want J.J. Keller's insurance industry, can I get an agreement with my insureds to allow you to send me the information? Would you honor that part of it so that we could get this information?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, this is for people in the compliance world. This is where sometimes the insured versus insurance world, compliance world, safety world. Sometimes there's disconnects where some of this information just doesn't seem to make it where it's needed. And we're a company that one of our core functions is just like the foundation is to make sure people know what they need to know so they can be safe. So yeah, we're more than willing to work and share.
So as an agent, you need to find out vendors are different. You need to look at vendors, ask your insured who the vendors are. We don't want to promote any vendor or not, but that's important because they all have different things. As Tom says, a lot of the motor carriers set those parameters up, and the more data they have, the more they have to use it. But if they don't access all the data, then that's going to hurt us later. So this is what we have to balance. And this is the first introduction to this. Tom, I really appreciate you spending this hour with us. I'm sure it's going to lead to a lot of questions, and we'll get to those questions later. We're out of time now, but for you who have questions, please email it, put them in your chat window, or email us, and I'll have Tom respond to that. Tom, as always, we thank you, and we thank J.J. Keller for this time and that you spent with us today. It's great information.
Pleasure to be here and glad to do it.
So for more information, again, contact MCIEF, and look forward to the next webinar next month.